Okay.
All right, so I know that a number of you are interested in the climb time work. And so I thought I'd give a verbal update about the climb time work. And then I will share some emerging work that is going on related to sort of all scales of climate action work that we are doing with a nonprofit and affiliated consulting firm that I started this spring because, you know, it was COVID. I was bored. I had to do something. So, and most importantly, like, you know, the writing has been on the wall for decades now around climate action and empowerment. And many of the things that are going on in the systems that I work in are moving, and they're doing that sort of, you know, 10 to 30 year structural move, which I find really important. But I also felt an urgency to do some other things that are situated in that type of same collaborative space, but that are more dynamic and flexible. And so I thought I would share some of that work. And Nancy's probably like heavy in the know about some of that, but I would, I'll share some of the others. And also just put out the offer for those who want to dig in on different aspects of the work. Okay, so climb time. So climb time is in its 4th year. We got refunded. I am going to say that one of the reasons I think we got funded is what sort of kicked me into forming this nonprofit. And that is that we are experimenting on ways of communicating about the work. And so we created something this year called the Project Portraits. And you can read about the different types of work going on in climb time through these portraits. And the portraits themselves are ways, they're objects like the STEM teaching tools. They're individual objects that we can actually use with legislators, or we can use with communities or schools. So they're helping us communicate what the work really is. And they're dispersing the network, because on each of the portraits, there's contact information for that project coordinator. So it's making the network flatter, and it's allowing the ability to actually amplify and accelerate work across the network. So just recently, like in the last week or two, OSPI, the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Washington State, granted new grantees for one-time effort this year. We actually had a whole new application process. The first 3 years we had the same cohort, but we have a whole new application process for this last revision. So we have potentially 2 years. They have to reapply after the 2nd year, but we have potentially 2 more years in this cohort. We have 2 more years of funding so far, but we are a line item in the proviso budget. We have $3 million a year, and it is the collaboration between community-based organizations, K-12 school-based and network-based organizations, scientists. So new into the network, we actually, I don't think, lost anybody. We are recruiting. We have the Institute of Systems Biology is involved now, as is Pascal Sherman Schools directly. And the last one was, the Dr. Brian Henning at Gonzaga University. And he is, his center, I have to just look it up because I can't remember what it's called. It's the Center for Society and the Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment. So they are also part of it now. So we're really excited to have everybody in. We're mentoring the new folks into the network through direct relationship building. As you know about the work I do, I'm all about research practice partnerships, which we actually sustain multi-year, get to know ya and stick with ya. We're like glue for our partners. And so we're doing that across the leadership team. And we will be launching later than normal because of a number of different issues internally in the state. So we are launching in September for this year. Normally we launch in July, but we're launching in September this year. And so we'll have meetings at the end of September 23rd and then 27th and 28th to launch the effort. Any quick questions on the climb time thing that I can help name details on that? Oh, one other piece. Part of the proviso allotment this year specifically went to tribal compact schools. So, and that was different than in prior funding years. And it was a revision based on the work that we've been doing in the state over the last few years to ensure that even the way in which ownership of funding decisions and ownership of funding sort of control resides with, has a justice lens in where it resides in the state. Anything else? Questions? So we will continue to post. One other piece of the Climb Time project that I thought might be helpful is we've added a number of different resource pages and reorganized our site a little bit. And one of the things that we had 3 years of work came to fruition was around our assessments. So we have a series of assessments, which many of you probably are interested in, that we situated in different contexts around the state and a giant assessment team. And I've been leading that effort in the state for the last 3 years. But we really wanted to iterate and like really think carefully about those materials before they went out. So they are also available now. And they're not meant to be assessments that, and you can read this in the approach, they're not meant to be assessments that are taken and used per se. They're meant to be educative. So like to learn what assessments might look like that are contextual for place and climate. All right. So feel free to ask other questions as we go on, but I'm going to switch gears a little bit if that's okay. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the nonprofit that I started this year. It is officially registered as a nonprofit in Canada. And we have a for-profit and a nonprofit arm. The for-profit arm is only there because there are just a few situations where you need to be a consulting firm as opposed to a nonprofit. So we have a couple of situations where we needed that. So we did the paperwork and we have that available.
What's the name of your nonprofit?
It is called Clear Environmental. And I'm going to just share a little bit with you about it. All right. I seem to have lost my window. Okay, so it's called Clear Environmental. And I'm just going to get the chat open. Here we go. Okay. All right. So the idea, and there's a tiny URL there so you can get into the slides themselves. It's helpful to get into the slides because I put a ton of different reading and resource in the base of the slides. So that might be really helpful for folks. So the basic question that we're trying to resource and work around is, how does learning mobilize society to act in equitable ways to foster just environmental and climate action? So this is the question of clean in so many ways. And it is the question that we are deeply committed to, and I have been for decades now, but we just needed a little bit more flexibility and adaptability than university contexts always provide. And so, and I also just needed more capacity. So many of you may have met my colleague, Chris Cameron, who I hired this spring. And she is working with me to just provide additional capacity and resource, and has been awesome. So guiding principles, which, you know, probably are pretty self-evident in the conversations we've had over the years, but just that idea that learning occurs everywhere and in all interactions. So we want to actually design for that. And that listening and observation are practices. So there are key things that we want to actually foster in everyone so that learning really does occur everywhere. And that sounds obvious in some ways, except it's not. There's often situations where we are boundary spanning between communities, and one community is transmitting knowledge to another as opposed to actually listening and observing and collaboratively working together. So we're trying to get into that space where people are really working collaboratively. Relationships foster justice through accountability and kinship. And kinship's actually intentional to say, like, we want to actually build our partnerships as families, as networks of peers and collaborators that actually are viscerally accountable and emotionally like invested in each other, because that's the way that we get justice. Like when you start to care about people and bring them into your circle, that's where we start to see a lot of justice layered in. Knowledge is a gift. So the idea that, we have, and that kind of goes with the responsibility. Informed action is responsibility. So, we are privileged and gifted to have the knowledge we do. We've worked hard for it for sure, but we have it. And because of this amazing ability that we have to know and understand the world around us, we're responsible to act. And we're responsible to act in lots of different ways, like to Amy's point earlier, of trying to understand what sphere of influence we have and what action looks like in that context. So getting down to the pragmatic is one of the things we're trying to do. Humility is an iterative practice. I was asked about this the other day. It's really easy when you know a lot of things and you're asked to speak in a lot of places, or you're invited in as an advisor in different spaces, to be full of yourself, like, very egotistical. And it's not a malicious thing, it just happens. So constantly trying to regain a stance of humility that, like, and this helps get back to listening and observation. So trying to think about the way in which we are trying to take a humble stance in the work. So even though we all bring expertise into a place, we're also listening to youth, we're listening to elders in community, to construction workers, and we're trying to understand what it is that they are bringing into this space, and hearing and seeing that really clearly. And you can only really do that if you have that kind of humble stance. And then this is something that was said to me recently, and I was just like, right, this idea that environmental and climate damages are a human and social problem, right? Environmental and climate change is not a scientific problem per se. We engage in scientific research to understand and frame the issue, but the solutions are to be found very much in human and social action. All right, so this all sits on the ground of work by Barbara Rogoff back in the 90s. And that's the idea that learning is a process of transformation and participation itself. How people develop is a function of their transforming roles and understanding in the activities in which they participate. So, anybody, anywhere, in any organization has a particular way of participating. What we need to do to shift the environmental and climate damage that's been happening is we need to shift the way that normed participation is in those organizations. And that's what learning is. Learning is fundamentally trying to get people to shift their activity in very fundamental ways. So I like this figure just because it's like so overwhelming in some ways. This is the terrain in which we're working. We're working in this space where everybody has a positional identity, and some of that's given to them, some of that's put upon them, some of that's things they claim themselves. We sometimes categorize these, like any of these categorizations around the side, but there's also lots of room in between, right? So I'm a hiker, I'm an outdoor activist. Where does that sit on here, right? And so thinking about all of these different identities and understanding that even the act of categorizing identities has use in some ways, and in other ways inhibits the way that we work together. So the utility of trying to understand our own identities and those we put on others is the idea that there are inequities associated with these things, right? So we see a lot of gender inequities, for instance, in the geosciences, a lot of racial inequities. And so we need to understand that, but we also need to understand that race and gender are socially constructed realities that we can change how we are understanding those. So that's a lot of the learning that I think we have to do as scientists, honestly, because I think many scientists struggle with that idea. Couple basic assumptions about equity and justice. So we have these things: colonization, racism, sexism, other types of oppression. They're here. They're because of historic and current actions. Science is in it. Science is not neutral or objective. And any of these points that you disagree with, feel free to just phone me and we can have a conversation about, because there's loads, and I put a bunch of the research for this in the slides. So because science has been complicit in injustices, science can also be a justice project. That doesn't make it less sciencey. It just makes it more situated in the social realities we face. Every one of us, this is one of the few binaries that I have in my life. Every one of us is an agent of either oppression or liberation. Ironically, we are both often, but the choice on which to be is something that we can choose. So we can choose to constantly be an agent for liberation in different issues of justice, even though we may not always be successful, because I understand we live in places that are constantly reaffirming oppressive structures. So trying to understand that choice is something that we have to actively do. And then in terms of science, I think it's really important to understand that we live in the world and our work should live in it. So trying to think about that. These ideas to learn about equity and justice are a responsibility. And that's a large aspect, I think, of the work inside the science community. And, much of it's still, unfortunately, inside the education community. So I've been doing a ton of work across different networks for a significant period of time. And it's deepened inside the last couple of years with trying to pull networks that were historically really separated together. And it's this idea that science and learning organizations are all around us, but they're almost so many that they're not even communicating. People are too siloed. So things are just not coherent across organizations. And so a lot of what I'm seeking to do is bring more people in different spaces into conversation and cross those boundaries. This happens at all scales. It happens at scales from the local, where I'm heavily involved in Salish Sea related work in Canada and the US, to national work in Canada and the US, and international work with UNESCO, UNITAR, and the federal, or the UNFCCC. And so all across those different organizations, lots of really great people are digging in and working, but some of them are well informed about science, some are well informed about equity and justice, and some are informed about both. Fewer are in the last category. So we need to make sure that the learning is moving across those spaces really deeply. These are a cross section of the folks that I would say in the last year that I've had active activity with in some way. Some of them are, again, at different scales. So, but it's about the sustained work. So for instance, the Kulkache Steering Committee, that is a collaboration with the Wasanich here locally. And it's been probably about 8 years of collaboration, community to community reconciliation efforts between the Pender Islands and the Wasanich. This particular effort called Kulkaches has been going on for 3 years, I think. And I'm on the steering committee, but I've also co-taught courses on climate action in place with Wasanich elders and youth. We are doing land back kind of efforts locally, and co-stewardship efforts. So a lot of work like that going on. And then it ranges up to things like the UNFCCC Paris Committee on Capacity Building Network. Thursday morning, I am co-facilitating with Chris, my colleague. And yeah, so this Thursday, Chris and I are co-facilitating a session on climate storytellers, which I can throw in the chat. And that work is really trying to think about how people are telling their stories related to education, training, and public awareness, really for climate work. There's the link for the climate storytellers if you want to join. And I think we have nearly 100 people registered from across the world, heads of different organizations and efforts. And we're doing it in collaboration with digital storytellers from Australia. And this was one of those things that we just there was a call from the PCCB network to do workshops pre-COP. We thought, hey, we could do that. And so we put a blurb in. They phoned us and asked us to get on a call with digital storytellers and do an international collaboration with them. And we're like, sure, we'll do that. So, so we're creating, it's a four-part series. And that four-part series will produce products, digital storytelling for the participants. And then we are able to put in a session. We don't have a guarantee yet, but it looks like we may have a session at the COP meeting to share those stories back with the world. And so, you know, to the point made earlier that, you know, if you can dream it up, we should just do it, because the time is nigh to be doing these things. So I just updated our page last night so you can have a look at some of the collaborations, and our website is just clearenvironmental.org. And you can have a look. I haven't hyperlinked all of the details for everything yet, but we'll get that up in the next day here. I'm trying to get it up before our Thursday event. So yeah, and so I'm going to pause there and see if anybody has questions.
Can I just have celebrations?
Yeah, right.
I am so excited by everything.
I know.
Wow,
I'm
wow,
so
wow.
excited too. Yeah, it's been a long time in the coming, Nancy, because, like, you know, I love my work with the Institute. I love it. And I think it's just been fabulous to be able to be involved in these big networked efforts like Access and Climb Time. But one of the things that came up, and I'll just share one last piece related to this it's not posted on our website, but I'll share it verbally. So Nancy and myself and quite a giant assortment of people now have been involved in an effort to get federal-based funding from the new administration across a university network with 10 regional hubs and some federal sort of national coordination effort at the level of 200 million a year. And it's called the Climate Justice Solutions Network. And so that type of effort, that's kind of what kicked it in for me, actually, was that work was really fascinating. And all of the conversations I got to have with people across the nation in these different spaces, both in like practice and research spaces, was so fascinating. And the thing that kept coming up again and again from some of the partner organizations was the worry that universities were too archaic, that they took too much of a bite, that they, while they have a lot of the infrastructure that's necessary for moving big money, that they weren't as adaptive or as equitable in the partnerships. And I was like, that's frustrating, because right now, like, we really need to be moving this, you know? And part of the work in that is, you know, I got to work with amazing folks inside the government and outside in deep, long-term environmental justice moves. And I'm still in collaboration with them. And it's spawning a bunch of other types of work that I just can't run through the university because they're too fast for the university timeline, and they're too small for the university structure. But they need to be done. So I'm not going to say no to them. So then how do we handle them, right? So this is what kind of spawned the Clear Environmental Move. And we this is the first time I presented on it like publicly. And we have more work than we can handle already. So we're doing a lot of the work for free as a nonprofit, and like have a sliding scale to be able to pull in money from contracts and things that we have to fund the rest of it. So I think we're going to take on an intern or two in the spring. And we have.
So what are the kinds of things that you're actually doing in this nonprofit now? I mean, what is the work that you're taking on that the university couldn't handle, and who's actually doing it? Are people from the university doing it, or?
No. So let me give you some examples, and I put the page in the last slide for the collaboration so you can see some of the actual work examples. So it ranges from things like talks like we're getting asked for at the rate about 2 a week right now to present in different places. So like we have a talk we're giving for the Center for Climate Justice at UC Merced in early September that'll be like live cast into the network. I did a podcast on the weekend for Can a Play, which is a really awesome environmental justice podcast that reaches like 5 million folks. The book project we did last year, this one, the Empowering Climate Justice, that was all for free. And it wasn't like there was no money to pay for that effort, and yet it still needed to be done. And we searched, like Frank and I searched for quite some time to find funding before we dove into that. And it's rooted in a participatory dialogue practice that was done last year. So facilitating and designing the dialogues, could be workshops. There's some like the PCCB workshop. There's some brief writing, but they're small, right? So like a brief that summarizes the ACE program and the international justice mandates and how they should weave together more. That brief was done with 3 colleagues internationally who are all situated in nonprofits. Again, no funding for it. So we're funding it with other contract work. So that kind of stuff is where we're going. And like, I could write grants for all of this, but then there's going to be a 1.5 year delay probably by the time you get the funding in place, and it's just not worth the wait. So that's kind of where we're at with it. Eric?
Yeah, thanks. This is exciting what you're doing. Just overall, great to hear. A question, maybe some connections and a question. So maybe starting with the question, because I was looking at the Climate Storytellers series of 4 optional 1 to 4 workshops. What are the sort of on the ground logistics? Is it like an hour per session? Is there a certain time zone that it's anchored?
Yeah, it's there. If you scroll down on the climate storytelling page, all the details are underneath it.
Okay.
That time zone issue is a major challenge because it's a global effort.
Okay.
We're presenting at 6 a.m. to be able to make it work for our Australian colleagues who are presenting their sessions at 11 p.m. And so because we wanted to keep the time consistent for participants so they could slot it into their schedule across the multiple weeks. But it was really like we had this debate back and forth about who gets up, who stays up. So that was the decision on the timeline.
I see there. Thank you. I found it. Yeah. So that's cool. That's just that's a lot of coffee. That's all.
Yeah. Anyway. I wanted to do it at 5 because I get up early and that would make it easier in Australia. But my colleague Chris was like, no, because she's not a morning person.
And the connection is back to the original conversation about the IPCC report and sort of, digesting how to make it more digestible and understandable. And it's, I think, I don't know if we've seen folks since I've been involved with CLEAN the last year from the Climate Reality Project, but it seems to me there's a lot of storytelling. That's the emphasis of that. A huge core piece of work that organization does is about storytelling and how to tell your own story and how to personalize it. Where it's lacking is the science oftentimes, because these are just lay people that are passionate about climate change, but they're not necessarily educators and not necessarily scientists. So I feel like there's an opportunity there to collaborate with that organization sort of more holistically. And it's something I'm trained in that, but I honestly haven't done a ton of it yet, but I'm intending to kind of really re-engage with that and start with my own storytelling piece, so your workshop is really like super timely, because I think the piece that I want to build my own skills in are around digital storytelling and around how to really unpack, like Frank was saying, all the tools that are available, and it seems daunting because there's so much out there, but I figure start with your own personal story, create it, pull in some digital assets, bring in the real science, bring in the real information, but make it interpretable, digestible to the layperson at the same time. Because a lot of what Climate Reality says is know your audience, right?
That's
it's
right.
about each time you do a presentation, you really want to cater it to that group and have those talking points ready to address the issues that are most germane to them, whatever background they're coming from. So anyway, thanks. That was just a connection, and maybe Patrick just planting a seed about the Climate Reality Project and Katie in terms of an emphasis or talk, something in the fall, connecting with that group, because I do think there's something there, and I'd be glad to help broker facilitate that. Again, not having done a lot of it yet, but intending to be more involved and intending to do some of these presentations that you do as part of being a reality leader. You're supposed to do 10 a year kind of a thing. So anyway, thanks, Deb.
And that's what I'm finding, Eric, is that in this weird eclectic space that I tend to occupy, where I'm, like I said, between science, between learning, and a lot of the communications and policy work. And one of the things that I've noticed is that people do need like connections and resources across those spaces, because I hear activists say things like we need climate action, but they're not specific, and I hear climate actions that are put out there, but the science behind it's not clear. I hear scientists communicating with no emotion, right? And no like connection to the personal. So their stories aren't being heard and like felt, right? And so one of the things about the PCCB workshop, which is really interesting, is that digital storytellers is really good at digital storytelling, but didn't know very much about climate. And so like for us to be able to partner with them, like we can bring in this lens of like, what does it mean to have like Article 6 of the framework focused storytelling? Like what is Article 6 and why should you care about communicating that to your policymakers, to your organizations? And again, we're not actually just going for policymakers, to the idea of like audience, know your audience. This is a all of society issue now, and has always been, I would say, but it's like radically an all of society effort now. And so part of the move is to actually make sure that people who are trying to reach audiences, so like Nancy, like your local space that you're working in, right? Like maybe what you're trying to do is reach business leaders in your community, right? And that's who you want to be speaking to. Or maybe it's business leaders who are speaking and they want to be speaking to the community more broadly, right? So like being able to really work with any community and figure out how they want to cross and communicate and collaborate. Frank? Oh, sorry, Patrick first and then Frank. You're in the cloud, your hand's in the cloud there, Patrick.
Ooh. I think you just touched on some of this question, but I was curious, to push on it a little bit more. You've got the briefs, you've got the presentations, and you've got the book, and I fully believe in the importance and power of creating new narratives to enable new realities. At the same time, I'm curious to know more about if what you are pushing for in the narratives, in the presentation, if it works, what does it look like? Mm-hmm. I'm curious about the change you're working to create through the nonprofit. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, for sure. So, it's interesting. I'm writing a paper right now with Ilan Chabet from Potsdam in Germany, and around what does collective empowerment look like and what is the shared future that we're working toward in that. And part of the challenge in this kind of work is that I don't know what the shared future is because it's co-constructed by the people involved. What we do know is we know what the current challenges are, and not everybody knows that, right? Like, so we need to have accurate understanding collectively about what we're really facing. And then from that, we need to figure out and dream like what it is we want to be and how to work toward that. So part of the work of this effort is actually figuring out how to get constellations of people who are stakeholders, for lack of a better word, in that space with each other, meaningful conversation with each other. So sometimes it's just facilitation of like conversations and networking with people. And by facilitation, I mean not just sitting in a meeting and facilitating the meeting, but like actually like hearing where people are struggling to hear each other and resourcing them to do that. So like if folks are like in my own local community, I work inside the Islands Trust, and I do a lot of this work as a locally elected official. And so one of the things I do is I listen carefully to my colleagues and peers and community members. And I'm like, okay, this person's struggling with understanding what reconciliation means and why I should care as a white person. This person over here is struggling to understand, what sea level rise means and why it's happening. Like thermal expansion is not on their radar. Right? And I need to resource them with that. So part of the facilitation move is actually that. It's listening in the community and understanding how to do that. So my vision of what this work does is it fosters that listening and observation skill in others through mentoring it, through engaging collaboratively with it, and helping people see what they know, what they don't know, and who to look to as experts to pull into that work with them. So it's like it's what's called not working in organizational change literature. It's like tying knots. I feel like I'm a knitter or a crocheter, like tying knots between communities in society that have been really siloed. And it's that siloing, I would argue, that's really causing us a lot of grief in being emergent strategy, adaptive people. Objects that we just like that you named are part of the resourcing move, but it's that social kind of not working that's really the activity of the nonprofit. Frank.
Yeah, Deb, thanks for sharing this in terms of the PCCB workshop. I think I'm definitely going to register for it. And just something I'm going to throw out here as an invite. As I said before, one of the things I'm looking at right now as I'm reworking the climate toolkit to version 2.0 is incorporating the interactive atlas in with it. And this idea of the storytelling and trying to link that to the science, as Eric was talking about, really intrigues me. And I would invite anyone here on this call that would be interested in working with me to write this investigation to drop me an email. I would appreciate having a collaborator on it. And you do get your name in lights in it. So no big bucks, name and lights. That's it.
Go past the big bucks on this, trust me. So yeah, I'm like essentially just figuring out how we can do enough grants to keep everyone employed to be able to do all the other things that we need to be doing. So yeah.
Well, that's the nice part for those of us who are retired. We don't have to worry about that part.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I will definitely reach out to you that way.
Okay.
One of the things you also made me think about is we are just starting to see the new implementation grants coming out of the federal government related to Justice 40. And I just saw the first one come down through the National Academies. And they are geared at being given to nonprofits that are having a history in environmental justice work. And because of the, significant amount of work I've done in this space for a long time, I have most of those collaborators in my networks. And so when I saw one of the calls come down, I reached out to a collaborator and I was like, oh, this would be really great to do. And like, we have 2 weeks to turn it around, right? Way too tight for my grants department. And it's not geared at a research. There's no research component to it. It's implementation only. And so I was like, okay, you want to do this? But I approached as the university because I was like, it's fair to do that. I make sure I'm not in a conflict of interest. And they were like, well, we don't want to do it with the university because it's not a research because of all that. Right. And I was like, okay, but they said, but we do want to do it with you because we think that it's a STEM focused grant. Right. And they don't have that expertise. They have the environmental justice expertise in context, all the local networks. They need the connection to scientists. They need the connection to STEM education formal structures. And so I was like, well, I'm totally happy to play that role in whatever way. So they will apply for the grant and I will be a contractor to them. Right. And literally that'll be like about how do we figure out who are the scientists across the Gulf region that they need to connect with through our networks, through AAAS, through AGU, whatever it is, right? That want to pull into collaboration. How do I pull them together and work with them, talk to them, get them a little bit up to speed on some of the histories of justice if they're not already, and then help them move and mentor youth in the region. And the youth are going to be the storytellers. It's going to be a storytelling effort too. But it's a mentoring / storytelling effort, right? There's a ton of practices about learning in it and mentoring and building those networks that we actually want as part of it. So So what's the object that comes out is sometimes not as relevant as the actual practices that you're engaged in as part of the work. So Tamara?
So I just have a question. Some of you know about this climate teacher professional learning community that I'm trying to get piloted. And the work that I mean, part of the effort of this group, and I won't go into the details of the group itself, but the idea is that the teachers work with community members around issues of climate change that are relevant to that community. And it seems to me that some of the practices that you are thinking about might help inform this group of teachers, this professional learning community. And it might be something, so I'm interested in seeing how I can get that support from you or your group so that the teachers that I'm working with, so that we can actually build that professional learning community with that external expertise from whether it's businesses, organizations, governments, whoever it is a relevant topic. Is that something that we could potentially partner on?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the work that I've done inside the Institute, so in the STEM teaching tools, is also really geared at that. We're putting out way more climate related STEM teaching tools in the next couple months.
And is this through Climb Time or?
Go through stemteachingtools.org. Here, I'll just stick it in the chat. And actually, Phil and I were talking about this because we got a legislative grant effort to do pre-service teacher education, and we're producing some modules for like how to help teachers learn to do this type of like phenomena, community situated work. So all of that will be available probably by next summer, like in a deep way. But one of the things that is interesting about that is that in this conversation, Phil and I were like, maybe we should put something out called climate teaching tools. Like we've had STEM teaching tools and it's like hugely successful as an effort. But maybe what we need is we need a more specific thing that tags some of the STEM teaching tools and actually develops new things like we're all talking about, which could be like IT related things that is actually climate teaching tools. So we're contemplating where to get significant infrastructuring funding to be able to support that over the next couple of years in the Institute. So that also might be helpful, and definitely would, Tamara, even if it isn't specifically what helps the effort you're talking about, like if we partner with Clear to do something with you, the learning that we would gain in working together, we could figure out how some of those resources could feed into that climate teaching space.
Our challenge right now, I've engaged a group of teachers, but our challenge right now is getting the funding to actually pilot it. We don't need a lot of funding.
That's
but
right.
It's how do we get to that one step? But if your group is willing to help out with, without money at first, then that would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so much learning to be done in this space. So I'm in. Yeah.
Okay, the other thing that I just want to make you aware of in case it is helpful, I'm on the board of directors of a group called Subject to Climate.
Oh, yes, I've heard about them. I'm so excited about their work.
Yes, and so it's just that everybody realizes the person that led this was from the Harvard Advanced Leadership Program that I was in a few years ago. And I ended up being a big collaborator on this, as is Ingrid from Don's group. We're both on the board of directors, and I introduced them to Clean. So the Clean Collection is part of this, but they go beyond that to a lot of the climate justice work. So that may be a resource that is also would be useful to your group. I'm glad you know about it already. So
yeah, I actually reached out to I have to think about her name right now, but
Margaret Wang.
Yeah, Margaret. I reached out to her because I actually thought she would be great to pull in on the grant that we're writing with the Environmental Justice Group in the South as like a potential portal space for some of the like youth narratives about environmental justice cases, because they could be used as teaching objects in the long run.
I've also suggested to them, and so Patrick, this is for you also, is that they do a presentation on the Clean Network sometime in the fall.
I would love to see that. Yeah. Yeah. Wendy?
I mean, I've been listening this whole time. so excited, and it's amazing how many things are moving forward. It's overwhelming. It makes me feel unable to actually comment intelligently, other than the comments that Tamara was saying about the collaboration and the opportunity, and the comments you were saying about the silos and the people, like we have people ready to move on justice, but they're not founded in science. And we have scientists ready to contribute their expertise, but they're not necessarily connected to those ready to move on the ground. And in much the same way, our program exists to bring the science to stakeholders, using teachers as our touch point, so that teachers who are ready to engage in this space do so with a foundation of making sure they just understand the science, because there's no assumption that they do. And Tamara and I are talking about how do we collaborate with her effort and ours to bring that science piece to the teacher participants as a foundational piece. But it's all related to what you were saying, Deb, is how do we take these existing programs, support them, including financially, and scale them up to meet the need. And we don't have those answers today, but I just couldn't let the whole call go without saying that's our passion and our commitment too. And we're deeply interested in making sure that happens in a rising tide lifts all boats kind of way. So I'm here. We care. We're players. We got to figure it out.
Absolutely.
We
And
will,
I think,
we will over time.
yeah. And I mean, there's been so much work. I mean, we're sitting on this like incredible wealth of network here, right? And so like how we actually figure out how to leverage that expertise in any one moment, I think it's going to be the project for the next 5 to 10 years as we go forward. Yeah, for sure. And it has been for many of you for a long time. Patrick, I think we're at the hour here.
Yeah, I do have another question, but I've already spoken. So if anybody else has a question, I'll let them jump in first.
Nice. Thanks, Amy. Thanks for all the comments in the chat too. They're very helpful.
And maybe this is for another time or an informal call, but I'd love to hear about how you're going about connecting the projects you're working within. So, you've got the setup where you're going in and helping to establish a shared understanding of where we're at and the options available so that we can co-create a shared future. And I assume you're doing that in multiple places in multiple ways. And I'm curious about how you're connecting the dots between those projects themselves so that they can build on each other and create a community as well.
I do have a little thought on that one, but it's still percolating in my head because it requires a lot more funding. But there are a few different efforts going on internationally. There's one inside Canada, and there's a few internationally that are about producing some kind of like ACE-ish, Action for Climate Empowerment type of like geo-referenced case sort of sites. And that would provide an opportunity for people to be able to basically take the Climb Time Portraits view, where you click on something, you see a portrait of that site, and you have the contact information. So if I'm over here in my little part of the West Coast and somebody else is on the East Coast, we're doing a similar kind of thing, we can search across the database, and then I can phone you and say, hey, so that would be ideal. There is some safety issues related to that. So pulling it into a member network is actually an important aspect because of the violence that's been done to some of the climate justice folks. So there is some safety concerns. All right, we will call it. And thanks so much for playing and just thinking with me about this, because this has been I've been very nervous to jump off this ledge for the last 5 years, and I just did it this year, and I feel like I feel a little bit like that. So we'll see how that unfolds in the next year. All right, have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Can we stop the recording for a sec, Patrick?
Yep. fact, we can stop it